Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. In this game, we're playing the Caledonian Highlander army versus the Hassassin Bahram, and the scenario is Firefight. So, before we get into the lists, one of the things I wanted to talk about is an interesting thing that I have noticed in reinforcements. Reinforcements, although they were talked about originally as arriving after you've taken a certain number of casualties, in practice, the rule is not actually written that way. How the rule is written is during the check for reinforcement stage of each turn, you check to see your total remaining points, combining your main force with your reinforcement force. And if the total number of remaining points is below a certain threshold, your reinforcements arrive. So in the recommended game size of 350 maximum points, if your combined forces that remain are 250 points, then your reinforcements arrive. And what that means is that you have a certain incentive to not necessarily play the full 350 points. If you've taken a slightly smaller reinforcement pool and a slightly smaller main force, then you have to sustain fewer casualties to trip that threshold and have your reinforcements arrive. And in some respects, I quite like this. If you ever think about, like, you've written a cursed points list where it's 297 out of 300 points, and you really don't have any way to spend those last 3 points, in regular Infinity, that kind of feels a little bad. In reinforcements, all it means is that you have just a very slightly lower threshold in terms of casualties you have to sustain, and every now and again, those 3 points less that you've spent might make a difference. But it also opens up the option for intentionally playing smaller forces. If you can build an army that does everything you think you want it to do, and it only costs you 340, 330 points, and you genuinely don't need to upgrade troops into other things, then you can potentially play that in the knowledge that your reinforcements will much more safely arrive more quickly. You're much more likely to have your reinforcements arrive in turn 2 than in, say, turn 3. It also means that you are less vulnerable to a phenomenon that I have seen people talk about and which I think is very practical, which is 100 points of casualties, which is if you have a 300 full 350 point list, that's how many points you have to sustain to trip your reinforcements. I would make the observation that there are a lot of 250 point primary combat groups that can be very comfortably dismantled with less than 100 points of casualties. And what that means is that there is a certain incentive, if you're playing the full 350 points, for your opponent to, and God help me for phrasing it this way, edge you along that 100 point limit without ever actually arriving at it, so that your reinforcements stay off the board and they don't turn up, or other words that might be synonymous with arrive or turn up, and just to keep you in a state of relative limbo for at least several turns until they can set up a sort of decisive situation where they're comfortable with your reinforcements arriving, and they let them turn up. Um, Edging, I think, is going to be not necessarily super common because there are certain things you can do about it in ARO, but it's something that players will have to keep in front of mind in many games. And if that begins to become a dominant tactic, then something that we can do about that is to see where we can trim points from our lists. And if we can reduce the points of a list down without actually compromising its resilience and capability, then that might be a really interesting space to explore. And what I have on the list now is kind of like a sensible example of a list that I think does that quite well. So I'm not going to go through the full list, but Caledonian Highlander Army are very well placed to play this kind of game. They're a very cheap army, they have access to very cheap, efficient troops, and typically in Infinity that only gets you so far, but in reinforcements, what it means is that this is a 315 point list, and there's not necessarily anything that I would really upgrade. You could definitely turn the war correspondent into a more actual dangerous troop. So, like a Cameronian, for example, it's just generating a 3 point regular order right now because Wallace is in the list. You could beef up these link teams, but Highlander Grey Paramedic Volunteer is super efficient, super lean, and I don't have anything about that I want to change. Um, you could turn this Cataran into a Scott Guard with a missile launcher, and in fact, one version of this list had that. But otherwise, there's nothing else that this list really needs. And same deal with the reinforcement section. It's got like everything that I want it to have. If I turned the 112 into, say, an Apache, for example, which I could afford to do, I've got 5 points spare in the reinforcements pool. I'd have a better attacker, but I wouldn't have a medic or a specialist. So I don't really have anything I want to add to this reinforcement pool. And so what that means is that this list is 315 points. which means that rather than having to sustain 100 points of casualties to trip reinforcements, it only has to sustain, I think that's 65, which is much more likely to happen and much more manageable, although, of course, this comes with the caveat that 65 points of casualties to this list actually takes a fair while to do. But you can lose kind of like 3 significant things, and that's likely to trip you over that line. So, for example, if I lose the Cataran, Usha, and one of the Highlanders or McMurrah, cool. Okay, we've tripped over reinforcements, and we still have, for example, the other Highlander and Usha or McMurrah left. So I think this is something that we'll want to explore. I think this is probably 315 is not how low most armies will go, but if you can slip your list down to 340 or 335, that's something to consider. Now, this is a sensible version of applying this in practice. Now let me show you what I actually played today. This is the non-sensible version of this list. This is madness. This is a 250 point, 350 point list. What that means is, on my first turn, when I do the reinforcement check, I will be eligible to trigger my reinforcements, even if I am going first. Having now played through this game, I actually would change this. This is a 5-person core with the grey, the paramedic, and 3 volunteers. It's not worth faffing around with the 2 extra troops in the core just to get +1 ballistic skill on the Highlander Grey. I would cut both volunteers and the war correspondent for 3 more Highlanders. Because Highlanders are very, very good, and then what that will let me do is I can run this as a Haris, and then I can actually core link these Highlanders just so that Wallace has got, like a core link. They're at least they're linked. They're much harder to kill if you're going second, because God, it's going to be a little scary with this list going second. Having those Highlanders just as an ablative defensive line when they're linked for plus burst, cover, sixth sense is going to significantly help. Otherwise, we have a very similar reinforcement pool. I really like this. There are definitely other ways to build an Ariadne reinforcement pool, but Margot and Duroc as the reinforcements are very nice. Margot got mimetism, among other things. This list they can turn up and they can spec fire, they can attack. Duroc is impetuous, which means that he can just impetuous forward. We've got a 1-1-2 as a paramedic, and then I've taken a Beast Hunter because Wallace is leading this list. So cool, 9-point irregular with a flamethrower becomes regular. 100%, absolutely. So that's the list, and honestly, yes, you can tell. You can tell that this is a 250-point list. This list is thin on the ground, but it feels a little bit like running an old N3 list, where there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things here, and in practice, well, let's get into that. Obviously, since we are playing Firefight, this list is also somewhat tailored for Firefight. The original version had more specialists, but I've trimmed them out because it's Firefight, and we have a 0-point Bashi Bazook who will be joining Combat Group 1. So Firefight is kind of like an ideal test case for this. Among other things, Firefight does track points of casualties, not points remaining. So it's going to be very difficult for my opponent. It's going to be very difficult for my opponent to outtrade me and score more army points than me in Firefight. So I have a lot of hope for this. Honestly, my impression of this list before I played it was that this was either the dumbest thing I've ever written or one of the potentially scariest things I've ever written. Before we get to the actual game, let's look at the Hackerslam list I would be playing against. So this is, with like one exception, a very, very sensible, I really like this Hassassin Bahram list. Before we get to the main list, I actually really like this reinforcement pool, and I think I might steal it. I was running the FTO Hakim with a Nazmat, just for extra doctoring. You put that on the Burtuk. But now that I've actually seen this, I think I like this more. So we have the Azrael, which is this is such a good reinforcement profile. 33 points of probably the scariest single gun in the game to deploy within 8 inches of you. Heavy shotgun, +1 damage, continuous. Damn, outstanding. Then there is a Haris team of a Sekban FDO. Sekbans are NCOs, so they can use the Lieutenant Order with a heavy rocket launcher and a chain coil +1 burst. The heavy rocket launcher means that there is it's burst 3, you have some actual range, and there's a doctor behind it. The Hakim is an excellent doctor, and in the Link team has a burst 3 medikit. And then the Burtuk, now he's gone with an Emirat, which I respect, but I think I would go with the heavy flamethrower, because you have the heavy shotgun. Like, if there is an enemy tag on the halfway line, that shotgun's going to turn up next to it, and it's going to absolutely rip it a new one. So you don't need the Emirat as much. I think you probably want the heavy flamethrower on the Burtuk instead. But otherwise, I am going to just steal this reinforcement group, I think. The rest of the list is a 9-4 split, and again, really like this second combat group. So it's 2 Matawis with jammers and chain rifles, a Ghulam Doctor with 2 Nazmats, and a guided missile remote. That's super lean, like support, the Doctor can do work, the missile can fire missiles, the Matawi can do their things. Totally, that's very, very nice. And then in the primary combat group, we have an unlinked 25-point Lestique viral rifle, 2 for days with the SCCWs, and then basically an unlinked Asawira. He's actually gone with unlinked in this case, Asawira AP Spitfire, and a core link of Yara Haddad, Barid Hacker, Ghulam, Ghulam, Ghulam. So the com link is in there being a specialist, and then you have a lieutenant and a decoy lieutenant. I would probably tinker with some of this list very slightly, but I also honestly couldn't tell you what I would really change. I like 2 Haris teams, but in Hassassin, because this is arriving as a Haris, the reinforcement group, just running a big core makes sense, and you've got to do something to get the whole army down under 250, and this is it. So um, overall, really like this list. I think you could maybe make the Asawira the lieutenant, but it can go on a run and kill things itself. Like, you've got a lot of options. You could even, if you wanted to, you could very easily flex this into a core and a Haris team. You've got the Ghulams to do it. Yara and the Barid and Asawira can all join those links, so you could easily do this as three-person links, and then just break one of them. If your reinforcements turning up, just break one of them, so you can Haris link the reinforcements. So yeah, overall, like this a lot, actually. There are some things here that I would do differently, but I'm stealing this reinforcement section for my personal use. So, to the game. This is the table we are playing on. For terms of terrain, if the building is open, it is infinitely tall and you can move through it. If the building has a rooftop, play to the rooftop. So we can see we have infinitely tall building here, infinitely tall building here, infinitely tall building here. These buildings are see into or out of but not through, but the windows block line of sight unless you are touching them. And then we've got, if you want to get up onto the rooftop, you just, from a door, and there are doors all over the buildings, you just pop up onto the roof using a short movement skill at the door, takes you to the corresponding space on the rooftop. We make the lieutenant roll, I'm 15 to 14, and then I just say, hey, can we fudge this because I'm testing something? And we fudged it in Chris's favor last game. He helped me with testing the reinforcement versus non-reinforcements. So in this game, we fudged it, and I'm just going first. I'm going first. He picks this side over here, and I start deploying my main combat group. So they're slightly out of frame here, but we've got 16 deployment zones in Firefight. The core link is all settled down over here, and the main thing is that the Highlander Grey is up on the rooftop. There's a bridge over these buildings that will enable you to. Actually, let me just fix that. That's better. There we go. So there's a bridge over this rooftop that I'll be able to potentially walk the Highlander Grey over, get some decent shots if I want to. We have Wallace number 1 hanging out down here, Wallace number 2 hanging out down behind this truck here. When I say Wallace number 2, I have a Bashi Bazooka in my list. He's just holo masking as Wallace. And then the 3 Highlander Greys are all kind of like on ground level here, inside this building, and here, ready to impetuous. They're all set up in positions where they ideally don't run straight into the enemy, but they set up for some decent smoke throws. Finally, the Warcore is hanging out back here, and that's pretty much the bulk of my main deployment, although McMurrough is going to reserve down here. For Chris's part, he sees all of this smoke and all of this like aggressive stuff, and he makes the call that he has to place hard AROs down. I've only got one gun, and he's pretty sure that McMurrough is coming. If it's not McMurrough, then it's Usha. So he sets up in order to hard arrow. So we have a standing missile bot here. We have a standing up on this building here. We have a standing viral X-rifle, and then we have core linked Yara Haddad standing here. Everything else around her hanging out in prone. Barid is on the rooftop here. Otherwise, we have the Asawira Doctor. So the Asawira in here. The Ghulam Doctor is hanging out back here with the Nazmat there, and another Nazmat up by the what's her name? Lasik. And then we have one Ghazi Matawiya there and one Ghazi Matawiya in this building. And this kind of hard ARO play actually feels like something that will probably become a little more common in reinforcements, because you want to deal some damage and take some damage and like pin. You want to take casualties on your own terms, so that your reinforcements arrive on your own terms. And like this missile, for example, this is an excellent missile aero piece. It's got this big old line here, and I don't have any guns to like deal with it. So yeah, hell, put it on Overwatch. That's excellent. Otherwise, in terms of the Fidays, one Hassassin Fiday has dropped down cleanly, just looking straight at my Highlander Grey on this rooftop up here, and then the other one is going to, after some contemplation, reserve drop down here just to be a threat. So at that point, the game begins, and Chris is like, tell me about your combat groups, and I'm like, actually, hold up, because I need to walk through the steps of the turn. The first step of the turn is my executive use of command tokens. I'm not going to do any, I'm not going to move anything between groups. The next thing we do is the reinforcement check. And it's at this point that he kind of like cottons on and goes, what what have you done? And then I say, okay, I have to do my reinforcement check now. My reinforcements plus remaining combat groups is 250 points, so I'm going to deploy my reinforcements. And this is all funny and well and good, but also like kind of intimidating and scary. However, walking back through everything, I do also think that he might have been able to see it coming, although, like, what the hell does he do, even if he can see it coming? You can't counter-deploy reinforcements, they're going to turn up after you turn, after, like, all of your stuff is deployed. But the reason he could see it coming is that Corvus Belli has confirmed that reinforcement groups are public information. Now, my reinforcement group was pretty beefy, but it was still like if you did the math on it, you could tell it was a little bit below spec. And if you have a very small reinforcement pool, I think you'll usually be able to do that. But this is actually something I think I have a significant critique of, because we were sitting here like walking through things, and I asked the question that I usually ask at the beginning of a turn, beginning of a game, which is how many troops can I see? And I asked that question out of habit, but because reinforcements are public information, I actually could do a perfectly accurate count of his army. And I determined, based on the number of troops in his reinforcement pool, plus the number of points that he had deployed, that either his 0-point Bashi Bazook was pretending to be a 20-something point model, or, and in which case he had a Hassassin Nadir, or his Bashi Bazook was not yet on the table. And I'm actually really sad that that's the decision that they went with. Like rules as written, yes, it's quite clear that reinforcement troops are public information because they are not covered by any exemption that says they are private, and you have to be covered by an exemption to be private. But I honestly, one of the things that I was really prepared to enjoy about reinforcements was the fact that suddenly we have private information back. Suddenly you can't just say your opponent, how many troops do you have? And they give you an answer, and you're like, oh, excellent. Well, now I know that you have no Noctifer. Because the combined army player, for example, could be running a 3-trooper, you could easily be running a 3-trooper reinforcement group, or a 4-trooper reinforcement group, or a 5-trooper reinforcement group. And if you don't know how many troops are in your opponent's reinforcements, then you can't just be like, oh, cool, there's no Noctifer. I know that with 100% certainty. Let's play the game. And and I miss private information being something that actually materially impacted the game. It's such a good rule, and reinforcements could have given it back to us, and it didn't. So that is one of the, I'm going to say, several missed opportunities due to what is kind of an unambitious decision by Corvus Belli. And if the community influences at any point in the future how the reinforcements variant is implemented or how it's played in practice, I would give serious consideration to just house ruling even that reinforcements are private information until they arrive. Just apart from the fact that that would make it consistent with every other troop that starts off the table and then appears, which it just helps for like player understanding of the game, it would give us back public information. But in any case, it does not matter in this game because my reinforcements have arrived on top of one. So in terms of how they've punted down, I've dropped the drop troop here, the drop pod here. I could have put something behind this. I'm using a piece of scenery to count as the drop pods. I could use it to gain cover. I mixed on that, but I think that's kind of cool. That's okay, as long as players don't take the piss. But what we've done is we've deployed Duroc here, the Apache here, Margot here, and then the Beast Hunter has come down here watching this Hassassin for day, and the 112 is also watching the Hassassin for day. So I get to perfectly counter deploy my opponent, and then I commence my impetuous phase, and when we go. And so right off the bat, oh, my opponent has to choose how to strip orders. And that's great fun because the reinforcement pool has immediately had the Comlink Trooper join it before order count is done. So it's got a whole bunch of orders, and then my main combat group has got 11 orders in it because of the Bashi. And he makes the somewhat tortured, but I think correct decision to strip orders from the reinforcement pool. So they're down 2 orders, but that's fine because McMurrough immediately activates, Impetuous is forward, he gets jammed and shot by Yara, and Yara puts him unconscious. She hits and crits and drops him to unconscious, but he double chain rifles her and puts her to unconscious. Otherwise, Galwegians will impetuous forward. This one will go forward to here. This one will go forward to here. Smoke will get thrown into the alleyway so that McMurrough can impetuous around to here. And that's basically just, it's been a while since I've had a really active impetuous turn, and I forgot how much I missed it. That was very cool. So what we then need to do is we need to clear off the mutt. So we use a tactical awareness order on Margot. She just peeks around. She puts the mutt down, takes her 2 orders, and then McMurrough goes. And McMurrough has 11 orders to spend, which means McMurrough is going to go absolutely ape. So he's going to come around here, move to here and then dodge, jump up onto the rooftop and kill the Hassassin Barid, jump up again and throw smoke down here, jump off the rooftop and kill this guy, move around here, throw more smoke, move around here, kill the other Ghulam that is hanging out down here, and at that point I stop because I've killed the two most likely lieutenant options. The only remaining lieutenant option is the Asawira. Otherwise, it was the Barid, Yara, and the two Ghulams, and then the Asawira. Those are the only things that can be a lieutenant. And I don't think the Asawira, given that he took two Ghulams, I am suspecting that the Asawira is not the LT. So I kind of like pause there and do some math. It's math time, and what I do is I come to the conclusion that I've killed about 70 points of troops. So if I want to edge Chris, who is a wonderful person whose company I enjoy immensely, I can kill like one more sub 30 point thing, which means a Hassassin for day or the Lasik, but not any more than that. So we still have plenty of orders to spend, and so what I'm going to spend those orders on is this link team is going to first try and deal with this Hassassin, and it takes a little bit of time, but I move around, I succeed the discover, I activate, and at that point, all I have with this Highlander Grey is pistols. I should probably actually have just sucked up the penalty to hit and find the HMG or something. Highlander Grey is not a fantastic choice, but I do basically a little bit of dueling. I try to get a Galwegian around here to this doorway to pop up and kill the Hassassin, but as I'm approaching, she dodges so that if I come up the doorway, she'll get a shotgun template over the Highlander Grey. So the Highlander Grey just pistols her to death. It takes slightly too many orders, but that's fine. We kill her as well. Now, from here, I'm like, okay, cool. I'm just going to leave it at that. But this is where we get into the too clever by half thing. I should have played this turn slightly differently. I should have done the things I'm about to do with my second combat group first. What I do is that this 112 declares a discover and then stands up. Actually, it stands up, yep, and it fires a Medi Dart at Durok and it fails. Okay, well, it misses, pops back down, tries to discover, actually succeeds discovering this Hassassin for day because it needs to like discover and move, something like that. And at that point, I activate the Beast Hunter and discover, and Chris just goes, "Oh, fine, I'm just going to shotgun you because I want to take that casualty. I want to have my reinforcements arrive." And I'm like, crap, I've screwed up here. And I have. I should have done this in a different order. If I didn't want his reinforcements to arrive, I should have done things accordingly. Potentially, for example, I should have done all of this stuff before I did anything to this Assassin for day over here, and then just exfiltrated my guy off the rooftop. But because it's happened this way, I fire the flamethrower, I kill her, she fires the shotgun, she kills me, and at that point I know the reinforcements are arriving. I have very few orders left in my second combat group, so I'm going to do what I can to limit the damage, and basically the remaining orders are going to be spent, basically the last two orders. McMurray's going to come around here, and he's going to kill the Comlink Ghulam, just to limit how much can go into my opponent's combat group. Now, I am not too cut up about the fact that I did not successfully stop the reinforcements from arriving, because I'm pretty sure that Chris is in loss of lieutenant. So the damage is going to be relatively limited, but I think I could definitely have played this like more carefully than I did. Regardless, though, I think I've killed something like 140 points of troops on the first turn. Literally all he has left in his first combat group are in his first army. He's got a doctor, the Asawira, the Lasik, and this missile bot, and that's it. That's the whole army that he's got left before reinforcements arrive. So that's a yikes. I even managed to put Yara all the way to dead at some point during this turn. I had a spare chain rifle with McMurray, so he can't recover Yara. So yeah, that's a successful first turn. The counterattack though is going to be pretty good. So this is what the board state looks like after the end of my first turn, and Chris's reinforcements are going to arrive, and he's going to deploy them in this space here. So it's going to be something like the Sekban here, the Bertok here, the Azrael here, and the Doctor back here, something like this. And even though he's in loss of lieutenant, because they're positioned in that kind of a place, it doesn't matter. They're always going to spend one order. Ideally, he would like to have benefited from the link, but like one of the interesting things, like yes, you can have chain of command reinforcement profiles, but you like reinforcements will attack very efficiently against an overextended enemy. And so like looking at this, I think Margot kind of like unavoidably had to be there, but I could have probably been a bit more conservative with things like the Apache, for example. So this Azrael turns up, and it just puts Margot down. The Apache dodges around here. The Bertok comes around to engage the Apache and this Galwegian. It wounds the Apache, but the Apache dodges into it. what does it do? It wounds like two face-to-face rolls. It wounds the Apache, then the Apache dodges into close combat. The sec ban completes in extremis recovery by euthanizing McMurrough, by euthanizing Durok, and like that's a pretty good counterattack. That was one command token to kill a very important troop, do a classified, and he could potentially have been like a little bit luckier. There were certain things I was doing against that Bertak that I could do because it had an Emarat, and so like there were certain things like I just wasn't too scared about getting isolated. He had to submachine gun me. Whereas if it had been a heavy flamethrower, it would have been like I would have had much tougher choices about how I was going to do certain things. But that's a very good counterattack. Uh, but then the first combat group does literally nothing because it can't do anything. The Metalia will move forward a little bit. The Lasik will go into suppressive fire, and then that's it. That's the whole turn. So this is the game state at the beginning of my second turn, and what will be effectively the final turn in the game. I have lost Durok. I have lost this Beast Hunter, and the Apache is wounded, but otherwise I don't think I've suffered any casualties. So I flip the War Correspondent into the into the Reinforcements combat group, and I go about my turn. And we've got a lot of things to do this turn, but we have a huge number of orders to do. Oh, I've lost my go as well, yeah. We've got a huge number of orders like to spend doing them. So because Durok is in my opponent's deployment zone, he can Impetuous around here, and he can chain rifle these two. He can't chain rifle the Bertuk, but he can chain rifle the Hakim and the Sekban, and he does so, and he actually takes out both of them, but is wounded in the process. And then that's a dodge on the Azrael, but doesn't exceed. Then I have to get the Highlander Grey off the roof, and then down and around here, and it takes up basically in the open here. It has a face-to-face roll against the Azrael. But the fight is beyond 32 inches, and I get it in the end, though. It takes two orders, but in the end, I put the Azrael down, and then I come back and around this way. Around this way, rather. I take a fight against the Suppressive Fire Lasik at long range. I put her down, and then I move up and around here and up and around this building, and I catch the Missile Bot, and I put it down. So at that point, I do a bit more quick math, and my opponent has a Doctor, a one Matawiya, and an Asawira left. He's in retreat. So what have I done in terms of classifieds? Well, we're going to have we've done Predator already. We've done Predator in spades. McMurrough did Predator with extra steps on the first turn, but what we're going to do is we're going to have McMurrough throw some smoke here to get past the Asawira, which is in suppressive fire, and then berserk into the Sekban, which will coup de grace it. That does extreme prejudice. I am securing Chris's HVT, which is here. So then I just spend the entire rest of the turn opening panoplies. I think I open like 4 panoplies. I have enough orders to, but it's just showboating at that point. He's got his Bashi Bazook, which is going to be in retreat. He's got 1 command token left. His Ghulam Doctor is in retreat. The Azrael and the Asawira and the Asawira and the Matawiya aren't, but those are not going to swing the game. There's really no he can kill something, but it won't even matter. He could kill my entire army, and he would not have killed more army points than me. He can't kill more lieutenants than me because he doesn't have enough command tokens to actually make anything happen with the Bashi Bazook, because he only got 1 command token left because he was in lost a lieutenant the first turn. So yeah, we basically we call the game there after workshopping things out, and like there's nothing that can be done. So that is I scored 11 points if you count the Predator bonus, but that is a 10-2. Chris has done 2 classifieds. He's able to in extremis recovery and experimental drug. He patched up the Bertuk after it took a wound. So that's a 10-2 win to Caledonian Highlander Army. Now, I mentioned before that I would change this list to trim down to a Haris team with the Highlander Grey so I can get more, get more Highlanders. But having actually played this, I'm still not entirely sure if it's madness or genius. Um, the reinforcements arriving on the first turn, like, I killed 140 points on the first turn, and I could have done less than that in order to delay reinforcements for a turn for Chris. It was not particularly challenging, and he was crippled by the loss of at about 90 points worth of losses. He was crippled. If this had been a different scenario where there were like lots of buttons to be pressed, I could have just spent the entire whatever. Cool, he's lost a lieutenant. I have to deal with 1 Hassassin per day. It's pinned back by like a mine or something. It's nowhere near my lieutenant. Cool, just gonna chill. Even if I've got 4 command tokens. I can trivially just bounce his reinforcements down the road. Although, if his reinforcements come on in a turn where they have full combat cohesion, maybe things are a little bit more difficult. If I go second, though, that's why the like, I'm still not 100% about this as a list concept compared to just a meme. If I go second, I have to survive an attack by with 100. I think I have 155 points in my main combat group. I have to survive an attack by a 250 point army. Now it's going to be probably a 250 point army with like 12 things in it. So the order pool will be limited, and I am going to be insulated by many Highlanders, but I will have to play that to actually see. Is it better to run 250 points than like 315, a sensible, just decent 315 point list? Or is it better to have lots and lots of aggro attack pieces like Caledonians that are just going to aggressively yeet across the board in the knowledge that if they die, then they will potentially bring my reinforcements on? I think there's like a balance to be struck there somewhere, but regardless, it is interesting to explore. I think probably overall the idea of like bidding a little bit with your points to get your reinforcements arriving earlier, that's kind of cool. I also don't know if it's really necessary. I don't know if that's how the game needed to be written. I suspect that the reason why they don't have you count casualties, they have you count points remaining, is because army counts points remaining. It doesn't count casualties. It does that so that it's easy to do a retreat threshold. And so they just worked with the technology that they have, and this is an externality, but it's a pretty weird externality. Being able to play a 250 point list and just kind of like have your reinforcements arrive immediately and kick the snot out of someone. Um, I wonder if they tested this. I wonder if this is something that actually did come up during playtesting, or if they just assumed that no one would voluntarily play 100 points down in order to accomplish this kind of a task. I think there are very few armies that can do this. Caledonians might actually be the only one. The next closest to do a serious initiative bid kind, like reinforcement bid kind of play, would probably be Dashat Company. And they're not going to be as good at it as Highlanders, although they might be better at defending. They have the same very high troop count thanks to the Ghulam comlink, but they have two Lobotos to hide behind rather than just Ghulams in the deployment zone. So, look, either way, that's the first official reinforcement game on the channel, and of course I had to try and break the format. There will be more to come. If you enjoy the content that I make, as always, you can support me by going to the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Your support really is very encouraging. It's not essential for the channel's survival, but it does really, really help me. I just know that people are out there that support what I do. Thank you to the people who have both already supported and pledged monthly support. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee. Otherwise, look, I hope you enjoyed this, and as always, I will see you next time.